The moment I saw Karen holding my newborn in her arms, smiling like she owned her, my world froze. My wife was crying, begging, while deputies dragged me away in handcuffs, branded as violent, unstable, dangerous, and all I could hear was my baby's desperate cries, echoing through the house we once called safe. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was war, and I had no choice but to fight back. Let's start. The first thing you need to know is that peace never lasts long in a neighborhood ruled by the wrong kind of power. It was supposed to be the quiet chapter of my life, the one where I could finally rest, raise a family, and watch the world slow down. But instead, I found myself standing on the edge of a nightmare that would test every ounce of who I was, not as a soldier, but as a father. And that nightmare began in the stillness of a single morning, the kind of morning where silence feels heavy, almost like it knows something is about to break. I remember the sound before anything else. Not the door, not the shouting, but the cry. My daughter, Grace, barely 3 days old, let out a piercing wail that cut through the dim light of dawn. That sound will never leave me. It wasn't just a baby's cry. It was the shattering of innocence, the first tear in the life I had promised her. My eyes shot open, and before my mind even caught up, I was on my feet, heart pounding, every instinct firing. The door exploded a second later. The cheerful blue front door I had painted with my own hands, a color I thought would mark the beginning of our peaceful life, was ripped off its hinges. That sound was different from the baby's cry. It was violent, cruel, and it carried a message. This house, your sanctuary, belongs to us now. Funny thing is, my first stupid thought wasn't even about danger. It was about the drywall that cracked when the door slammed into the wall. That's how the mind works in shock, grabbing for something normal in the middle of chaos. Then came the voice. Female, sharp, dripping with smug power. Child Protective Services. We have a warrant. Stay where you are. My stomach twisted. I knew that voice. Everyone in Oakwood Creek knew that voice. Karen Lowe, the president of the HOA. She had found her way inside my home, and she wasn't alone. The heavy stomp of boots followed, echoing down the hallway, not even trying to be quiet. They wanted us to hear. They wanted us to be afraid. I stood in front of the bedroom door, blocking the path to my wife. Kylie sat up in bed, her face pale, the strain of the C-section still etched across her features. She clutched the sheets like they could shield her, eyes wide and terrified. I saw her pain as the stitches in her stomach pulled tight. She whispered my name, her voice trembling, begging for an explanation I didn't have. I raised my hand, silent, steady, telling her not to move, not to speak. That's when the door burst open and the queen of our suburban prison appeared. Karen stood there, framed in the doorway like she owned the moment, her lips painted red, her hair frozen in its sprayed shell. Behind her loomed 3 large men dressed in cheap tactical gear. They weren't real professionals. They were props, muscle for hire, meant to intimidate. One of them held a gurney and another carried a camera, its red recording light blinking like a soulless eye. They wanted proof. They wanted a story. There they are, Karen announced, her voice rising for the camera. The unstable father. The helpless mother. The poor child who needs saving. She pointed straight at me, her manicured finger shaking like she had already judged me guilty. David Martinez, you are a danger to your family. We are here to rescue your daughter. Rescue. The word twisted in her mouth, poisoned by her arrogance. She waved a piece of paper in front of the camera, claiming it was a court order. My wife's sobs filled the room. She begged them to stop, pleaded that Grace was only 3 days old, that she needed her mother. But Karen didn't hear her, or maybe she didn't care. She only nodded to her men, commanding them to take both my wife and my baby. Grace wailed louder, her tiny chest heaving with fear she couldn't understand. That cry was more than just sound. It was a mark in time, the exact moment when everything I had promised my family was put on the line. I saw Karen smirk. I saw the camera's red light. I saw Kylie's pain. And I knew, without a shred of doubt, that this was the line. The room shifted in my mind. It wasn't just a bedroom anymore, it was a battlefield. Every object became something else, a weapon, a shield, a chance. The oak chair by the window, the lamp on the nightstand, the distance between the men and the crib, all of it registered in an instant. The part of me I thought I had buried, the Navy SEAL, the man trained for chaos, was awake again. I told them to get away. My voice was flat, cold, not even sounding like mine. Karen laughed, an ugly bark that filled the room. She told them to ignore me, to take the baby. The first man reached toward the crib, his shadow falling over Grace. Time slowed. My wife's eyes widened in horror. The camera's light burned brighter. Karen's smile stretched like she had already won. And that's when I moved. But I won't tell you what happened next. Not yet. That's a story of fists, fury, and choices you can't take back. What matters here in this beginning is the weight of that moment. A father standing between his family and the monster who thought she was untouchable. A mother, broken from birth but fierce in her love. A child, too new to the world to understand that her first memory might have been taken from her, and there was the door, the shattered blue door lying broken on the floor. That door became more than wood and paint. It became a symbol. It had once marked the start of our new life, the hope for peace. Now, broken in half, it stood as a reminder that peace is never given. It has to be defended. That broken door would return in my mind again and again. A reminder of what was taken from us and what we had to fight to protect. You might be asking yourself right now, what kind of world lets a neighbor come into your home with fake power? Fake papers and try to steal your baby? How could anyone believe her? How could this be real? And that's exactly why I'm telling this story. Because people like Karen thrive when others can't imagine just how far they're willing to go. So before I continue, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in my place? If your newborn, just 3 days old, was about to be taken by people who had no right to touch her, would you stay still? Would you trust that the system would sort it out? Or would you fight, with everything you are, to protect the ones you love? Think about it, because that's where my story begins. And trust me, this was only the opening move in a battle that would rip apart everything I thought I knew about safety, justice, and the meaning of family. The moment I swung that oak chair and sent the first man stumbling back, everything inside me snapped into sharp focus. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. Training does that to you. It strips away hesitation and leaves only instinct. The kind of instinct that tells you exactly how to survive when survival feels impossible. Within seconds, 2 of Karen's hired thugs were down, and the third was gasping on the carpet. But even as I stood there, breathing hard, ready for the next move, I knew something wasn't right. It was too easy, too sloppy. Karen wasn't the type to risk everything without a bigger plan waiting in the shadows. Her smirk was gone, but her eyes still burned with something I couldn't quite read. Hatred, yes, but also certainty. Like even in her failure, she was still winning somehow. And then I heard it. Sirens, not faint in the distance, but right outside. Red and blue lights spilled through the window, washing over the wreckage of our bedroom. 2 sheriff's deputies stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. My body froze, not because of fear, but because in that instant, I understood Karen's play. She had called them in advance. She wanted me in cuffs, painted as the violent husband who had just assaulted 3 supposed officers of the court. The deputies didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They only saw what Karen wanted them to see. 3 men in tactical gear groaning on the floor, a sobbing mother clutching her stomach, and me standing in the middle of it all. To them, I was the threat. As the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, I caught Kylie's eyes. She wasn't just terrified, she was broken, watching her husband dragged away while strangers reached for her baby. Grace's cries were louder now, desperate, echoing off the walls. That sound carved into me like a blade. Karen's smile returned as the deputies pulled me to my knees. "See?" she said with false pity. "Exactly what I told you. Violent, unstable. Now please secure the child before someone gets hurt." Her words weren't just for the deputies. They were for the camera still blinking in the corner, capturing every second of this nightmare. I had been turned into her villain, right there in my own home. This is where the past started bleeding into the present. Because the truth is, I had lived through scenes like this before. Chaos, deception, the feeling of being surrounded with no way out. My deployments had left me with scars no one could see, and Karen was counting on those scars to do her work for her. All she had to do was whisper the right story, and suddenly I wasn't a father defending his family. I was a soldier who never left the battlefield, a man too unstable to be trusted with his own child. That's when I realized this wasn't just about harassment or control anymore. This was about erasing me. They wheeled Kylie out on a gurney, her body trembling from both pain and fear. Grace was in Karen's arms now, squirming and crying against a woman who had no right to touch her. And I was helpless, dragged down my own hallway in cuffs, forced to watch the two people I loved most taken from me. But what Karen didn't know was that she had already made her first mistake. Because while she thought her camera would frame her narrative, my cameras had already been rolling long before she kicked in that door. And my cameras didn't lie. If you think this story couldn't get darker, wait until you see how deep Karen's plan really went. That night, sitting in the back of a patrol car with my wrists burning from the cuffs, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just another deployment, another mission where the enemy wore a uniform. This was my home, my wife, my newborn. And the enemy was a woman hiding behind rules, papers, and power. I had fought men with guns and bombs. But how do you fight someone who uses the law as their weapon? The answer came in the form of a memory. A lesson drilled into me years ago, back when I thought my uniform was the only thing that defined me. My commander had told me once, the most dangerous enemy is the one who doesn't come at you head on. They come sideways, smiling, holding out a hand while slipping the knife in with the other. At the time, I thought he was talking about combat overseas. I didn't know he was describing a woman like Karen Lowe. That memory hardened me. If Karen wanted a war fought in shadows and lies, then I would fight her there. I had already started building the foundation, logging every violation, every threat, every ridiculous fine. I had installed cameras that streamed to a secure server, not just for safety, but because deep down I had sensed this day would come. My past, the discipline I had tried to leave behind, was now the very thing that would keep us alive. But here's the thing about wars. You don't always know who your allies are until the bullets start flying. That night, as deputies processed me and Karen strutted outside with my baby, a black unmarked van pulled up at the curb. Out stepped men I hadn't seen in years. Old teammates, brothers who never truly leave your side even when you think you've left theirs. They were part of a special county SWAT program, moonlighting as instructors, but to me they were more than that. They were the cavalry. The flashbang that went off seconds later was deafening. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. Karen thought she had the stage, but the real show had just begun. My brothers moved with precision, clearing the house, pinning Karen's hired muscle to the ground, and ripping the fake court order from her hands. Within minutes, the narrative had flipped. I was no longer the violent father. She was the fraud caught on tape, exposed for the monster she really was. For a moment, I thought it was over. But monsters don't die easily. What do you do when your enemy smiles, even while wearing handcuffs? Karen didn't scream when the cuffs clicked around her wrists. She didn't beg. She didn't even look surprised. She only stared at me with a hatred so pure it almost looked calm, like she had expected this and was already planning her next move. That look told me one thing. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The very next day, my phone rang. It was Rick, one of the men who had pulled me out of that nightmare. His voice was tight, uneasy. "You're not going to like this," he said. "She's out." My stomach dropped. Out? How? Karen had been caught forging documents, orchestrating a kidnapping, leading armed men into my home. Yet here she was, walking free because her husband's law firm had posted a bond so large it barely made a dent in their accounts. That's when the second phase of her attack began. Articles started appearing online. Local HOA president attacked by unstable veteran. The words burned into me. They twisted my military service into a weapon against me, painting me as dangerous, unstable, unfit to raise a child. They took Kylie's exhaustion from childbirth and turned it into a story of mental illness. Neighbors who barely knew us were suddenly anonymous sources describing me as aggressive, threatening, unstable. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about the court of public opinion, and Karen knew exactly how to play it. This is where the contradictions became clear. She was doing bad, but she disguised it as good. On the surface, she was the community leader protecting a fragile family. Behind the curtain, she was the predator who tried to rip my newborn out of her crib, and the world was eating out of her hand. I remember watching Kylie one night trying to feed Grace. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the bottle. Tears ran down her face as she whispered, "Maybe we should move. Maybe she wins." Hearing that broke me more than the handcuffs, more than the headlines. Because the truth is, part of me agreed. Maybe leaving was the only way to protect them. But then I looked at Grace, her tiny face pressed against Kylie's chest, and I knew running wasn't the answer. If we left, Karen wouldn't just win. She'd own us forever. Sometimes the scariest battles aren't fought with fists, but with whispers that turn your friends into enemies. That's when Fred entered the picture again. The neighbor everyone thought was just a lonely old man with roses and bad jokes. But Fred had his own scars, hidden beneath years of quiet observation. One night, after everything seemed like it was caving in, he told me a story about his son, how Karen had destroyed him, how she had bled his business dry until the shame drove him to end his own life. And then Fred's eyes hardened in a way I had never seen. "Don't let her do to you what she did to him," he told me. "Fight her with everything you've got." His story lit a fire in me. It wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about every family she had destroyed, every life she had poisoned to feed her power. And with that fire came a plan, not to run, not to beg, but to fight in ways Karen could never see coming. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized Karen wasn't just a neighborhood tyrant. She was connected to something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone had guessed. And that's where the next threat emerged. One that would prove Karen wasn't just playing HOA games anymore. She was tied to people who didn't forgive mistakes, people who saw human lives as nothing more than collateral. The storm had only just begun. Fred's story didn't leave me that night. After he spoke of his son, the silence between us was heavy, filled with ghosts I couldn't see but could almost feel pressing against my chest. I walked home with his words echoing in my head, "Fight her with everything you've got." But when I closed my door, the reality of what that meant hit me harder than anything I had faced in combat. Fighting Karen wasn't like fighting insurgents on foreign soil. Out there you knew who the enemy was. Here the enemy wore lipstick, smiled for the cameras, and shook hands with judges. I sat in the dark, listening to the steady hum of the baby monitor. Grace's soft breathing was like music, fragile and pure, a reminder of why I couldn't give up. But alongside that comfort came doubt. What kind of father was I? Kylie was breaking under the pressure, and Grace had barely entered this world. I promised them peace, but instead I had brought them into a war. Was I protecting them or dragging them deeper into danger with every choice I made? The question burned at me, and guilt crept in where anger had once been. My training told me to act, to hit back harder, but my heart whispered something else. Maybe you've already failed them. That inner voice was louder in the quiet moments. When Kylie looked at me with eyes that begged for a normal life I couldn't give, every scar from my past deployment seemed to reopen, each one whispering that I wasn't cut out for this. Not as a husband, not as a father. Have you ever felt the weight of protecting someone you love so much that it almost destroys you in the process? The next day, the fight between my head and my heart only grew worse. Kylie suggested leaving again. Her voice shook as she spoke, and I could see that this wasn't weakness. It was survival. David, please. Let's just go. We can find another home somewhere she can't reach us. Grace deserves better than this. The pain in her words cut deeper than any wound I'd taken in combat. Because she was right, Grace did deserve better. But leaving meant surrender, and surrender wasn't something I knew how to do. That's when I made a decision that changed everything. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was the only path I could see. I reached out to someone I had promised myself I would never contact again, an old comrade known in our circles only as Echo. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was something else. Digital shadows, manipulation, secrets that could ruin lives without firing a shot. Calling him meant stepping back into a world I had sworn I would never return to. But Karen had left me no choice. When Echo picked up, his gravelly voice was the same as I remembered. Calm, but dangerous. I thought you were out, he said. I thought you wanted a normal life. My throat tightened as I answered. They pulled me back in. This time it's personal. I hated how cliché it sounded, but there was no other way to say it. He didn't laugh. He just asked me what I needed. The decision to involve him weighed heavy on me. I knew the risks. If I used Echo and his team, I wasn't just defending my family, I was waging war. And wars leave scars, not just on you, but on everyone you love. Still, the alternative was unthinkable. Letting Karen destroy us piece by piece until nothing was left. Sometimes the hardest part of fighting isn't the enemy. It's realizing the battle will change you forever, as Echo and his team dug into Karen's world. I kept fighting my own battle at home. Kylie started pulling away from me, not out of anger, but exhaustion. She was tired of being strong, tired of pretending that we could fix this. At night, when Grace finally slept, she would sit quietly in the dark, staring at nothing, her mind somewhere I couldn't reach. I wanted to hold her, to promise her it would end soon, but every time I tried, the words died in my throat. The pressure built until one night I broke. I confessed to her that I had reached out to Echo, that I was pulling in people who didn't live by the rules. I don't know if it's the right thing, I admitted. But it's the only thing left. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't cry or shout. She just looked at me with eyes that were equal parts fear and hope. Then you'd better win, David, she whispered. Because if you lose, we lose everything. That moment cut me in half. On one side, her words were fuel, permission to go all in. On the other, they were a weight heavier than any load I'd carried before. Winning wasn't just about evidence or strategy. Winning meant saving my wife from breaking, saving my daughter from growing up in the shadow of a monster. It meant saving myself from becoming something unrecognizable. As days passed, the information started pouring in. Echo's team found trails of embezzlement, money laundering, even blackmail files Karen kept on city officials. But it wasn't just the discovery that shook me. It was the confirmation of what I already feared. Karen wasn't acting alone. She was part of something larger, something criminal, something that stretched far beyond property lines and HOA meetings. And suddenly I realized why she had looked so calm when the cuffs went on. She knew she had protection, not just from her husband's law firm, but from an entire network of corruption. It was in that storm of revelations that another character stepped into my life. Fred came to me again, not with advice this time, but with a confession. He had been watching Karen for years, gathering his own evidence, digging into her past. He wasn't just the lonely neighbor he pretended to be. He was a man consumed by the need for justice, maybe even revenge. When he handed me a worn leather ledger, Karen's father's old record book filled with decades of corruption, I felt the full weight of his obsession. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in him, a man who had lost everything, driven by the need to take down the person who destroyed it all. And in that reflection, I saw a warning. If I wasn't careful, if I let my hatred consume me, I could end up just like him, living only to see my enemy fall, forgetting to live for the people I still had. The scariest mirror you'll ever face is the one that shows the monster you could become. The moral conflict tore at me. Fred wanted Karen destroyed at all costs. Echo wanted to blow her network apart with one decisive strike. But Kylie wanted peace, a life where our daughter could grow up without fear. Which voice was I supposed to follow? If I pushed too far, I risked dragging my family into dangers even worse than Karen. If I pulled back, I risked losing everything anyway. The breaking point came late one night. Grace was crying, her tiny fists clenched, her face red from exhaustion. I picked her up, rocking her, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. And as I held her close, the weight of my choices hit me all at once. What if Fred was right? That only destruction would stop Karen. What if Kylie was right? That leaving was the only path to survival. And what if both were wrong, and my fight would only end with me becoming the very thing I despised? The guilt pressed harder than ever, but so did the resolve. I wasn't just a husband or a father or even a former SEAL. I was all of it, and for better or worse, I had to use every part of who I was to end this. The next morning, I made my choice. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't let hatred consume me, but I also wouldn't fight clean. Karen had crossed a line no one should ever cross, and for that, there would be consequences. My family's survival depended on me walking that razor's edge between justice and revenge, and that's when the next move came, one that proved Karen wasn't done yet. A letter appeared on our doorstep, crisp and official-looking. Inside was a new notice, but this one wasn't about garden gnomes or paint colors. It was a demand for a full psychiatric evaluation of Kylie, citing concerns for the child's welfare. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was the beginning of a legal battle to declare us unfit parents. The fight had reached a new level, and I knew the storm was about to get even worse. The letter sat in my hands longer than it should have. White paper, black ink, official seals. It didn't look threatening at first glance. But the words burned like acid the moment I read them. A psychiatric evaluation for Kylie. Karen wasn't just pushing us. She was pulling us into a place where every weakness, every moment of exhaustion could be twisted into a weapon. She was aiming straight at my wife's heart, at her identity as a mother, and I could feel the ground beneath us starting to crack. Kylie was in the kitchen when I told her. She was making tea, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. I handed her the letter, and she read it slowly, her lips pressing tighter with each line. When she looked up at me, her eyes weren't filled with fear anymore. They were hollow, empty, like she had finally run out of tears. "She's taking Grace from me," she whispered. The sound of her voice broke something inside me. Because deep down, I knew that was exactly what Karen wanted. Not just control of our home, not just revenge, but to strip us of the very thing that defined us, our family. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight, every thought circling the same truth. Karen wasn't going to stop until we were destroyed. She wasn't going to settle for driving us out of Oakwood Creek. She wanted to erase us, to turn us into an example for anyone who dared to stand against her. And if the law was her weapon, then the law had already failed us. What do you do when the very system built to protect families is turned into the knife meant to cut yours apart? I thought about Fred's words, about his son, about the ledger sitting hidden in my desk drawer. The book was a weapon, pages of names, transactions, secrets spanning decades. Proof of just how deep Karen's corruption ran. But holding it in my hands felt heavier than any rifle I'd ever carried. Because once I used it, there would be no going back. No second chances. If I played that card, I wasn't just fighting Karen. I was declaring war on everyone she had in her pocket. The days that followed blurred together. Kylie tried to act normal, tried to care for Grace like nothing had changed. But I saw the way she jumped every time the phone rang, the way her hands clenched when the mail came. I caught her once, sitting in the nursery with Grace in her arms, staring at the wall. I stepped into the room quietly and saw tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying out loud, just silently, like she didn't want to wake the baby with her pain. That was the gaze moment that will stay with me forever. A mother silently breaking while holding her child. It was the kind of sight that carves itself into your soul, reminding you of both the fragility of love and the cruelty of those who would tear it apart. Echo kept feeding me information. Emails, transfers, surveillance footage. Every file made Karen's world look dirtier, darker, more dangerous. But with every discovery, my doubt grew too. Was I becoming the very thing I hated? Someone willing to twist the rules, to fight in shadows? I thought of my daughter's face, how someday she would ask me about all this. Would I tell her I saved her? Or would I admit I crossed lines that can't be uncrossed? The breaking point came at a meeting with my lawyer, a man I trusted from my Navy days. He laid it out for me bluntly. If you fight this clean, she'll bury you in court. She's got the DA, she's got the board, she's got money. You'll lose custody and you'll lose Kylie in the process. If you want to keep your family, you're going to have to burn her world down. He didn't say it with malice. He said it like a friend who had already accepted the truth for me. Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between survival and destruction. That night, I made the decision. I opened the drawer, pulled out the ledger, and laid it on the table. Kylie sat across from me, her eyes searching mine, waiting for me to speak. This ends now, I told her. But once I do this, we can't go back. Not ever. She didn't argue. She didn't plead with me to reconsider. She just nodded, her hand finding mine across the table. That quiet gesture was all the permission I needed. The plan came together quickly. Echo's team packaged the evidence, the ledger, the financial crimes, the recordings from my cameras, into one massive blow. It wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. It was about tearing down the whole rotten system she had built around herself. The IRS, the FBI, the press, they would all get hit at once. A strike so big no one could bury it. But as I prepared, doubt crept back in. Was I protecting my family, or was I dragging them into something bigger than any of us? What if I failed? What if the blowback swallowed us whole? I thought of Fred again, of how his quest for justice had cost him his son. Was I walking the same path? The turning point came sooner than I expected. Karen called a community meeting at the HOA Center. She wanted a public spectacle, a chance to humiliate me in front of everyone. My lawyer tried to talk me out of going, but I knew this was the moment. If I stayed silent, she'd frame me as the coward, the unstable veteran who couldn't even defend himself. If I showed up, I'd be walking straight into her trap, but I couldn't let her hold the stage alone. The room was filled with neighbors, reporters, even a few local officials. Karen sat at the front like a queen holding court, her husband by her side, her smile wide and poisonous. She began with rehearsed lines, painting me as dangerous, unfit, unstable. I stood there, silent, letting her words echo in the room. letting the crowd shift uneasily in their chairs. And then I reached into my bag and pulled out the ledger. The gasp that went through the room was real. Even Karen's smile faltered for a second. I didn't slam it down or shout. I just held it up, steady, letting everyone see the worn cover, the faded lettering. "This," I said quietly, "is the truth. And once it's out, no one in this town will ever look at you the same way again." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Karen's face twisted, the mask cracking for just a moment. She knew what I had. She knew the game had changed. But then she leaned forward, her smile snapping back into place. "You don't understand what you're doing," she hissed, her voice low but carrying. "You think this is about you? You think you can win. If you go down this path, you'll burn with me. What if destroying your enemy also meant destroying yourself? Would you still take the shot?" That night, as I drove home, the weight of what I had done pressed on me. There was no undoing it now. The ledger was out in the open. Karen knew I was willing to use it, and that meant she would strike back harder than ever. I looked in the rearview mirror at my daughter sleeping in her car seat, and I wondered if she would grow up safe, or if I had just signed her future away to a war she never asked for. When we got home, the first sign of retaliation was already waiting. Our front door was spray-painted in red, the words "unfit parents" scrawled across it in dripping letters. The sight made Kylie gasp, clutching Grace tighter against her chest. I pulled her inside quickly, but I knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't going to rely on court papers anymore. She was going to turn the whole town against us, twist every neighbor into a weapon, every rumor into a blade. And as I stood in the wreckage of our once peaceful home, I realized we had crossed the line. The war wasn't coming. It was here. And from this point on, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. The spray-painted words stayed on our door longer than I care to admit. "Unfit parents" glared at us in angry red letters. And though I scrubbed until my hands were raw, the paint bled into the wood like it was part of the house now. Neighbors slowed their walks to stare. Some whispered. Some crossed the street. The message wasn't just for us, it was for everyone. Karen had declared open season on the Martinez family, and she wanted the whole community to know it. Inside, Kylie paced with Grace in her arms, whispering soft lullabies to cover the sound of her own shaking voice. I tried to steady her, to remind her we still had allies, but even I didn't believe it anymore. The silence of our neighbors wasn't just fear, it was compliance. Karen had them cornered, and no one wanted to be next. That night I sat at the table with the ledger open in front of me, page after page of rot and corruption, names of people I thought I could trust. Some were familiar, others were shocking, but one name stopped me cold. It wasn't Karen's husband or the DA or even a judge. It was Fred, my neighbor. My friend, next to his name were figures, payments, not from Karen but to Karen. Old entries, stretching back years, landscaping contracts, hush money, even a line about silence regarding Michael. My chest tightened, and I felt like the air had been ripped out of the room. The man who had warned me, who had told me Karen destroyed his son, was in this book. He wasn't just a bystander. He had been part of it once. What happens when the person you trusted most turns out to be holding the same secrets as your enemy? I closed the ledger slowly, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to throw it across the room to believe it wasn't real. But the evidence was in black ink, written decades before I ever moved into Oakwood Creek. Fred hadn't just been a victim, he had been in the game. Maybe he switched sides after his son's death, maybe guilt drove him to fight back, but the betrayal stung all the same. The next day, I confronted him. He was in his yard, trimming roses, the same calm expression he always wore. I walked up with the ledger in my hand, opened to his name, and laid it on the fence between us. "You want to explain this?" I asked. For the first time since I'd known him, Fred's composure cracked. His hands froze and his eyes darted from the page to my face. He sighed, a sound heavy with years of regret. I did work for her, yes, he admitted quietly. Back when Michael was still alive. I thought I could keep her satisfied, keep her claws out of my boy's business. But you can't bargain with a snake. She bled us anyway. His voice trembled now, stripped of the witty charm he usually carried. I tried to play her game, David, and it cost me everything. I wanted to believe him, wanted to see the broken father instead of the man in the ledger. But the doubt lodged itself deep in me. Had he guided me all this time to help me or to use me? The deadliest betrayals aren't always from enemies. They're from friends whose truth you never wanted to see. The distrust gnawed at me. I started noticing small things. Fred knowing more than he should, showing up right when Karen made her moves, pushing me toward certain actions. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was strategy. But once doubt takes root, it grows fast. Kylie saw it too. "You're pulling away from him," she said one evening as we rocked Grace to sleep. "Do you think he's lying?" I hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know." That uncertainty twisted everything. Fred had become my mirror, showing me what obsession could do to a man. But was he reflecting my path, or was he dragging me down his? The ledger didn't just expose corruption, it exposed the cracks in my trust, and once those cracks opened, the whole foundation shook. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. The psychiatric evaluation notice wasn't just a threat anymore. It turned into an official summons. A date was set, papers stamped, all designed to strip Kylie down in front of strangers who would decide whether she was fit to be a mother. I watched her fold the letter with shaking hands, her lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. "They're going to take her from me," she whispered again, the same words as before, but now with a finality that chilled me. That night, I made a choice I swore I wouldn't make. I asked Echo to dig into Fred. Not Karen, not the HOA, not the DA, Fred. The man who had handed me whiskey when I was at my lowest, who had shared the story of his son, who had stood beside me like family. I told myself it was just precaution, but deep down I knew it was suspicion. Echo didn't take long. Within hours he had files, records, old contracts. Some showed Fred working for Karen's husband's firm decades ago. Others hinted at debts he had paid off mysteriously, money that could only have come from her. But there was one thing that chilled me more than anything else: phone logs. Calls between Fred and a blocked number traced back to the same burner phones Karen's people used. Recent calls, not years ago, weeks ago. I stared at the printouts, my stomach twisting. Fred wasn't just a man haunted by his past. He was still in the game. What if the ally standing beside you is the very reason the enemy always knows your next move? The revelation broke something in me. I wanted to storm across the street, shove the papers in his face, demand the truth. But a darker part of me held back. What if confronting him too soon made things worse? What if he was already too far gone? I couldn't risk it. Not with Kylie hanging by a thread and Grace at the center of it all. So I played along. I nodded when Fred offered advice, smiled when he shared stories, even let him believe I still trusted him. All while knowing that the man sipping coffee on my porch might be feeding Karen everything. The pressure grew unbearable. The date for Kylie's evaluation loomed closer. The neighbors grew colder, their stares sharper. Even my own mind began to fracture under the weight of it all. At night, I'd sit awake listening to Grace breathe, my chest tight with the fear that any day could be the day she was taken from us. And then came the twist I never saw coming. Echo called one night, his voice sharper than usual. "David, you need to sit down," he said. I braced myself, expecting another detail about Karen, another threat of corruption, but what he told me flipped everything upside down. "The ledger you gave me, it wasn't just her father's. Fred added to it. He's been keeping records too. Not against Karen. Against you." I froze, the phone pressed tight against my ear. Echo continued. "Conversations? your security feeds, even notes about your temper, your past deployments, your fights with Kylie. He's been documenting you the same way he documented her. My heart sank. The betrayal wasn't just financial or historical, it was personal. Fred hadn't been guiding me out of kindness. He had been building a case, a mirror image of what Karen was doing, but with a neighbor's smile instead of her lipstick grin. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, the weight of it crushing me. The man I thought was my ally had been keeping his own weapon aimed at my back the whole time. And worse, I realized why. Fred didn't just want Karen destroyed. He wanted control. He wanted to take the power she had stolen and claim it for himself. The truth cut deep. I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. I was caught between two predators, one obvious, one hidden. And both of them had their eyes on my family. The next morning, I saw Fred in his yard, waving like always, the same warm grin on his face. But I couldn't see him the same way. Behind that grin was a man who knew too much, who held too much, and I knew the confrontation was coming. Not with Karen, not with the HOA, but with the neighbor I once trusted with my life. The war had just shifted, and now every move I made would be against two enemies, not one. Would Kylie believe me when I told her? Would she survive knowing that the man she thought was our protector was another wolf in the dark? I didn't know. But I did know one thing. The darkest moment wasn't here yet. It was still coming. And when it did, it would either shatter us completely or force me to do the one thing I had spent my life avoiding. Because once Fred showed his true face, there would be no turning back. The morning after Echo told me the truth about Fred, I felt like the air in our neighborhood had changed. Every step I took, every sound outside the window carried a weight I couldn't shake. The betrayal lived inside me now like a splinter lodged too deep to pull out. I had seen betrayal before, in war, in politics, in men who claimed loyalty but sold it for power, but never from someone I let this close. Fred wasn't just a neighbor. He had been inside my home, sat at my table, whispered advice into my ear while secretly keeping track of my every weakness. Kylie noticed the tension right away. She asked me why I was pacing, why I kept looking out the window, why I stared too long at Fred's house across the street. I wanted to protect her from the truth, to carry the weight myself, but she deserved more than silence. So I told her. I told her everything. The ledger, the phone records, the files Echo uncovered. At first, she shook her head, refusing to believe it. No, not Fred. He lost his son. He helped us. But as the words sank in, I saw the denial fade from her eyes. She knew I wouldn't make this up. She knew the look on my face wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. What do you do when the friend you leaned on becomes the shadow you fear the most? That night, I couldn't hold back anymore. I walked across the street to Fred's yard. He was sitting on his porch like always, sipping coffee as if the world hadn't shifted beneath us. When he saw me, he smiled. But it wasn't the same smile I had seen before. Now it looked sharp, hollow, like he knew the mask didn't matter anymore. I stood at the bottom of his steps, fists clenched, voice shaking with more than just rage. "How long?" I demanded. "How long have you been playing both sides?" Fred didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said quietly, "Long enough to know you'd eventually figure it out." The calmness in his voice made my skin crawl. He explained himself in fragments, how Karen had promised him protection once, how she had ruined him anyway, how he realized the only way to beat her was to know her game better than anyone. "And to do that," he said, "I had to watch you. You were the wild card. You were the one thing she couldn't predict." His words stung because they carried some truth. He wasn't lying about his pain, but the way he twisted it, the way he justified betraying me, made my blood boil. You could have told me the truth, I snapped. You could have been honest instead of stabbing me in the back. Fred shook his head slowly. Honesty doesn't win wars, David. Secrets do. And I'm not sorry for keeping mine. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of silence where two men who once stood as allies now stared at each other as enemies. In that moment, I realized there was no saving what we had. Fred had made his choice, and so had I. When I turned to leave, he called after me. His voice carried a warning, one that sank deep into my bones. Karen's just the beginning. You think destroying her will end this? You're wrong. You're walking into something bigger, darker, and if you're not ready, it'll eat you alive. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because part of me already knew he was right. Sometimes, the final battle isn't about defeating your enemy. It's about surviving the truth they leave behind. The day of Kylie's psychiatric evaluation came like a storm we couldn't avoid. We sat in that sterile office, the white walls buzzing under fluorescent lights, as strangers dissected my wife with cold questions. They asked about her sleep, her fears, her thoughts in the middle of the night. They asked if she ever felt unsafe with me. Every word was recorded, every hesitation noted. I held her hand under the table, squeezing gently, but I could feel her shaking. Karen wasn't in the room, but she didn't need to be. Her shadow hung over every question, every pen stroke, every raised eyebrow. She had built this moment perfectly, and for the first time, I wondered if we were already beaten. But then Kylie did something that silenced the room. She spoke not as a woman cornered, but as a mother. Her voice was steady, almost defiant, as she said, I am not broken. I am tired, yes. I am scared, yes. But everything I do, every breath I take is for my daughter. And no one, not Karen, not this HOA, not anyone, will take her from me. The examiners didn't respond. They just scribbled their notes. But I saw something shift in their eyes, just enough to give me hope. Afterward, as we walked out into the parking lot, I saw Fred leaning against his car. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to know. But there he was, arms crossed, eyes locked on me. I wanted to confront him again, but before I could, he spoke first. She won't stop, David, you know that now. And you know the only way this ends. For the first time, I saw something raw in him. Regret, maybe even shame. It didn't erase his betrayal, but it made me realize that in his own twisted way, Fred wasn't wrong. The system wasn't going to save us. The law wasn't going to save us. It was up to me. That night, the storm inside me broke. I had carried guilt, doubt, fear, and betrayal for too long. But now it was clear. Karen had taken everything she could from us. She had turned neighbors into spies, friends into traitors, courts into weapons, and still we were standing. That had to mean something. When the storm finally breaks, you either drown or you rise from it stronger than you ever thought possible. The confrontation came 2 nights later. Karen called another meeting, this time in the neighborhood hall, her last attempt to paint us as unstable, unfit, dangerous. But I didn't come empty-handed. I brought the ledger, Echo's files, the recordings, everything. When she stood at the front of the room and began her speech, I walked down the aisle, my daughter's cries echoing from the back where Kylie held her. Every eye turned to me. I laid the evidence on the table in front of her. This is who you are, I said, my voice low but carrying. This is what you've built, and tonight everyone will see it. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I let the truth speak for itself. The room erupted. Neighbors gasped, whispered, some even stood and left in disgust. Karen's mask slipped, her face contorting as she realized the walls were finally closing in. But even then she didn't crumble. She leaned forward, her voice venomous. You think this ends me? You think a few pages of paper undo years of power? You don't know me at all. Her words were a reminder that even in defeat, she would fight to the bitter end. But for the first time, I felt the tide turn. The whispers weren't about me anymore. They were about her. The spotlight she had craved now burned her alive. And then came the twist none of us expected. As the meeting spiraled into chaos, Fred stood up from the back of the room. He held a folder in his hands, his face pale but determined. "There's more," he said loudly. "Much more." He walked to the front, laid the folder beside the ledger, and turned to the crowd. "I was part of it once. I paid her. I kept her secrets. And it destroyed my family. I won't let it destroy another." The room went silent. I stared at him, disbelief and anger warring inside me. Was this redemption or another manipulation? I couldn't tell, but the effect was undeniable. The neighbors who once whispered against me now whispered against Karen. The truth had split open wider than even I had imagined. The emotional climax wasn't in Karen's downfall. It was in the shattering of illusions. The woman who ruled the HOA was exposed. The neighbor I trusted was revealed as both traitor and reluctant ally. And me, a father who once doubted his strength, stood in the middle of it all with everything on the line. The meeting ended in chaos, police called, officials scrambling. Karen was escorted out, her screams echoing through the hall. Fred walked past me without a word, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't read. And Kylie stood at the back, holding Grace close, tears in her eyes, not of fear this time, but of relief. But even as the dust settled, one truth remained. This wasn't over. Karen still had connections, still had power, and Fred's sudden turn left more questions than answers. The core battle had exploded, but the war was far from finished. As I carried Grace out of that hall, her tiny hand clutching my shirt, I felt both victory and dread. Victory because we had survived the fire. Dread because I knew the flames hadn't gone out. They were just shifting, waiting for the next spark. And in that quiet moment, as my daughter's breath warmed my chest, I realized the real fight wasn't about the HOA, or even Karen. It was about protecting the fragile hope we still held as a family. And that hope, fragile as it was worth everything. The days after the meeting felt like standing in the wreckage of a storm. The air was still heavy, charged, and no one quite knew where the pieces would land. Karen was gone from the neighborhood, escorted out in handcuffs, but her shadow lingered over every corner of Oakwood Creek. Some neighbors avoided us, ashamed of their silence. Others offered small nods, quiet acknowledgments that they had seen the truth with their own eyes. But none of it felt like victory. It felt like survival. Kylie tried to return to routine, rocking Grace in the nursery, humming the same lullabies she had whispered before the chaos. Yet even in those moments I saw the cost etched into her face. She had carried fear for so long that it left lines where none had been before. She smiled more now, but the smiles came slowly, like they had to fight their way through old wounds. Grace grew, innocent and untouched by the fire that had raged around her. But when I held her close, I knew the price we paid was not invisible. It lived in me, in Kylie, in the silence that filled our home at night when words no longer came easily. Fred disappeared for weeks. His roses wilted, his porch light stayed off, and his once proud yard fell into disarray. When I finally saw him again, he was thinner, his shoulders stooped, his eyes tired. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He only nodded at me across the street, a silent acknowledgement of what we both knew. The war had cost him too. He had revealed his part, exposed himself along with Karen, and now he was just another ghost wandering the ashes of what once was. The HOA board fractured. People resigned, others were replaced, and meetings turned into quiet affairs instead of battlegrounds. The rules still existed, paint colors, lawn heights, fines, but their power had cracked. Neighbors no longer feared them the way they had. The illusion of control had shattered, and with it came a strange kind of freedom. Yet it wasn't joyful. It was somber, like a town that had learned too late what it had allowed to fester. For me, the hardest part was learning how to breathe again. The instinct to fight, to prepare for the next strike, never truly left. Every car that slowed outside, every letter in the mail made my chest tighten. Echo told me once that battles don't end when the enemy falls. They echo through you long after the last shot is fired. He was right. Karen was gone, but the fight lived in me, in the way I scanned every crowd, every face, waiting for the next threat. And yet, there were moments of peace. One evening, I stood in the backyard watching the sunset bleed across the sky while Grace giggled in Kylie's arms. The sound was soft, pure, untouched by everything we had endured. For the first time in months, I let myself believe in something fragile and beautiful, that maybe survival was enough, and maybe survival could grow into something stronger. The neighborhood never fully returned to what it had been. Trust was broken, friendships strained, but slowly life stitched itself back together. Children played on sidewalks again. Porch lights flickered on at dusk. Laughter returned in small bursts, tentative but real. The scars were there, but so was resilience. Fred and I never spoke again, not really. We lived across from each other, two men bound by betrayal and survival, but the bridge was burned. Sometimes I saw him in his yard, pruning the roses that had bloomed again, and for a moment I wondered if he found the peace he had lost. Other times I wondered if he was just another prisoner of the secrets he carried. The cost was heavy, but what remained was undeniable. My family was still mine. Kylie, stronger than she ever believed she could be. Grace, a light that kept burning through the darkest nights. And me, a father who had been forced to face every fear, every doubt, and still stand. The storm had stripped us bare, but it had not broken us. One night, long after the chaos had ended, I sat on the porch with Grace asleep against my chest. The air was still, the street quiet, the roses across the road swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time, I didn't look over my shoulder. I just listened. To the crickets, to the soft hum of the world moving forward, to the steady heartbeat of a life we had almost lost. And in that stillness, I realized something simple. The battle wasn't about property lines or rules or even justice. It was about love, about holding on to the people who make life worth living, no matter what storms come. That truth didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. The story ended not with triumph, but with endurance. Not with glory, but with grace. And maybe that was enough. As the night deepened, I whispered a silent promise to my daughter that no matter what, I would always fight for her, always protect her, always carry the weight so she didn't have to. And with that, I finally felt something close to peace. The last image I leave you with is simple. A father sitting in the quiet dark, his child sleeping against him, the world finally still. A family scarred but unbroken, a neighborhood forever changed, and a truth that lingers long after the story ends. Because sometimes the real victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in keeping your heart alive when they tried to take it from you. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, I invite you to join me here. Subscribe to my channel, HOA Truth Tales, for more stories of battles fought behind picket fences. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, your story matters. And together we remind the world that no storm lasts forever.